Welcome back to Foresight Paradigm. This is Paradigmatic Conversations or Discussions number 4. We're speaking with the author and scholar Tim Whitmarsh. It's an honor to have you on, sir. How are you?
I'm very well, thanks very much. Yeah, and thanks for having me.
Excellent. And we have Jason Sylvester back. Hey, Jason, how are you?
I'm very good. How are you?
I'm good. So we're going to be discussing ancient Greece and the history of atheism in ancient Greece. And Mr. Whitmarsh has a great book called Battling the Gods, Atheism in the Classical World, and we're going to be kind of going through that. So I would like to open the discussion with a quote from Bertrand Russell from his History of Western Philosophy, which I'm sure you're both familiar with. So he says, in all history, nothing is so surprising or so difficult to account for as the sudden rise of civilization in Greece. What they achieved in art and literature is familiar to everybody, but what they did in the purely intellectual realm is even more exceptional. They invented mathematics and science and philosophy. They first wrote history as opposed to mere annals. They speculated freely about the nature of the world and the ends of life, without being bound in the fetters of any inherited orthodoxy. What occurred was so astounding that until very recent times, men were content to gape and talk mystically about the Greek genius. So when we look at ancient Greece, it's obviously the foundation of so much in the modern world, democracy, philosophy, theater, all kinds of things. But your book, Mr. Whitmarsh, focuses more on the atheism in the ancient world. So can you tell us a little bit, because we know the Enlightenment is really kind of the womb of modernity. And, Peter Gay was an Enlightenment scholar, and he had a book called Enlightenment, The Rise of Modern Paganism. So definitely, to some extent, it was that, right? It was kind of, starting with the Renaissance, the rediscovery of classical, authors who did, speculate freely about the world without any kind of dogma. And I do want to quote quickly from your book towards the beginning. You say in 18th and 19th century Europe, the formative era for modern atheism, classical learning was ubiquitous among the educated at least. In that period, those who campaigned for a world without gods could appeal to the authority of Epicurus and Lucretius, or refer to Diogenes of Melos and Theodorus of Cyrene in full confidence that they would be understood. Since the early 20th century, however, classical awareness has shrunk with alarming rapidity. It is only through profound ignorance of the classical tradition that anyone ever believed that 18th century Europeans were the first to battle the gods. So, Mr. Whitmarsh, if you could kind of give us a general layout or history of ancient Greece, how it formed, why it was so important, and the atheism that we find there, and what you kind of mean by atheism in the classical sense, back then, what that would mean.
So we've got 2 hours, have we, to answer that? It's a big
About
question.
An hour, so. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So what I would start by saying that Bertrand Russell's position is not one which would be shared by many classical scholars these days, because it speaks of a kind of exceptionalism. It says that the Greeks and the Romans are somehow very distinct from other cultures. I mean, we know now, and I suppose we've always known that, the Babylonians had mathematics, the Egyptians had mathematics, and so forth. And many other civilizations have had very complex forms of abstract thought that you might or might not choose to class as philosophy. So I wouldn't say that the Greeks and the Romans are, in that sense, sort of superior to other cultures. What they have had is a formative role in the formation of particularly Western thinking, but not exclusively Western thinking, because we know that medieval Islamic thought, for example, was very heavily dependent on a dialogue with ancient Greece as well. So I'm slightly careful about these sort of narratives of, if you like, a straight linear enlightenment, as if we were as if the Greeks helped us out of primitive states of mind and started the job that the European Enlightenment finished off, because that ends up with a very Western-centered view of things, which I think I want to resist. But I would say that there are certain features of Greek society that really were quite distinctive. I don't say superior, but they were distinctive. So one of these is, for example, the distinctive mode of social organization, which we tend now to call the polis, the root of the word political, police, politics, and so forth. So the polis was a community of citizens in its most extreme form of democracy. And by citizens, of course, we mean the free, adult, male populace. We don't mean women, we don't mean slaves. It's not a democracy in our sense, but it was a community of people who had an equal stake in the city. There were other forms of organization, tyrannies and oligarchies and so forth, that were less horizontal than the democracy, but they still had that same distinctive polis structure of the idea of the citizen. So that is one really important element, the idea that the voice of every single enfranchised individual has a significance and a value. And the other feature, which must be connected to that, I would have thought, is the relatively weak role of priests in Greco-Roman culture, particularly Greek culture. That's to say, priests, their job was simply to manage temples, manage temple resources, manage ritual activities. They didn't have any jurisdiction over morals, public morals, and so forth. Public morals were determined in the public sphere by whatever body was holding power at that particular time. But particularly in a democracy, for example, that means that you get people, human beings, gathering around, debating about what is the optimal thing to do at that particular time. You don't get someone claiming with God-given authority, this is what we have to do. You have a debate about it. And I think that that dialogic debate structure is absolutely central to Greek thought.
Okay, excellent. But when you say atheism in the classical sense, what do you mean exactly?
Yeah, there was that question as well. Thank you for reminding me. Yes. Now, the word atheism is an ancient Greek word. It comes from two elements, the alpha at the beginning, the A, which is what we call an alpha privative. It means the absence of something. And then theos is a god. So atheism literally means the absence of divinity. And in Greek contexts, the word atheos, the adjective atheos, meaning atheist, can be used in two very different ways. It can mean either somebody who is God-forsaken, someone who is abandoned by the god, someone who in their extreme state is loses God's favor. So that's a very theistic model of what atheism might mean. Or an later development of the same term is something close to what we mean by atheist now. That we say someone who takes a philosophical position that there is no, that minimizes divine or supernatural control over our lives. But I'm being very cautious here because this is not a monotheistic culture. In monotheistic cultures, it's very easy to be atheist because you've only got one God to disbelieve in. The Greeks lived in a world which was saturated with all forms of divinity, not just the Olympian gods, but Pan, Greek gods, nymphs, abstractions like fortune and victory. So disbelieving in all of these simultaneously wasn't, I mean, it's not the case that every single atheist disbelieved in every single aspect of what we would now call supernatural intervention. It's a very different way of organizing the religious world. You see what I mean?
Right. Okay. Very interesting. I would like to get into specific figures that you kind of cover in your book, and I'm going to share my screen to kind of match some faces up here. So let me know. See it pretty clearly. There we go. All right. Now, let's start off with the Pre-Socratics, actually. Mr. Whitmarsh, so I've heard that the Pre-Socratics, the Ionians, you know, they were kind of the first people to really search for natural interpretations of the world, you know, without any, you know, recourse to divine intervention or, you know, gods of any kind. So what can you tell me about them, about the Pre-Socratics, the Ionians?
So from the 7th to the 6th centuries BCE, the coast of what we now call Turkey, the western coast of what we now call Turkey, was in constant contact with, and particularly in the 6th century, in contact with the Persian Empire. And that presumably put them into contact with, we don't know this for sure, but with Babylonian ideas of mathematics and astronomy. So you get Greek thinkers particularly from the 6th century onwards, beginning to take a huge interest in cosmology, in understanding the nature of the world around us. And as you rightly say, they start rejecting traditional mythical models for the formation of the world, which are typically, the gods created this, the gods created that, or whatever, and start using more mechanistic models. So they will say something like the cosmos is like a wheel going around, and the stars are like gaps in the tire, as it were, that's on the outside of the wheel, and we're in the middle, and we can see the stars as bits of light coming through the outside. So it's a way of understanding the world in not just naturalistic, but also in, as I say, mechanistic terms. In that respect, these are the beginning of these figures represent the beginning of a story, which is the uncoupling of gods from explanation for the nature of the cosmos. But we do need to be careful here, because none of these figures, until arguably you get to the 5th century, and then evidence is always the problem with these. We don't have complete writings of any of these pre-Socratics, so it's always very fragmentary and tendentious, and what you actually argue about these people can change on depending on where you put the accent. But many of these figures insist very emphatically on the existence of various forms of divinity, but they seem to identify this divinity not with the anthropomorphic, that's to say human-shaped figures of the Homeric epics, Zeus and Poseidon coming down and hurling spears and thunderbolts and so forth, but with abstract principles that are more closely associated with the natural force that drives and animates the universe.
Okay. Can you see the image pretty clearly, or is...
Yes.
Okay. All right. So yeah, this is the a bust of Protagoras, and I know we have some kind of a fragment of his work left that talks about, he doesn't know whether or not the gods exist or not. So can you tell me about him a little bit, Protagoras?
So Protagoras is the next stage. So the Ionian stage is the earlier stage of Greek philosophy. That's the west coast of Turkey phase. By the time we get to the 5th century, it's Athens, the famous democracy, the site of the Parthenon, and the power that is instrumental in the defeat of the Persians. It's Athens and democracy that becomes really the honeypot for intellectual culture. So Protagoras is not from Athens, but he's attracted to Athens by the wealth of the city, but also its favorability to intellectual ideas. He is best known as a relativist, which means that he believes there's no absolute truth, that not only is humanity the arbiter of what is truth, but also individual humans are the arbiter of what is true. So, for example, we are all in different time zones, and Jason's up there in Bangkok, and for Jason it is night. For me, it's the middle of the afternoon. For you, Landon, it's morning. Okay, we can accept that in terms of time, but then when it comes to something like, the same object might feel hot to somebody with a certain kind of illness and cold to someone else, whatever. And what Protagoras would argue is that both that is true. It's equally true for both of these people, that the perception of it being hot or cold is true for those individuals. And from this relativistic position, the idea that there's no truth as to whether this thing is hot or cold, it's simply how it appears to that one person, he extrapolated a larger system of ontology, if you like, of being and truth, and that included the gods. So his famous fragment that you referred to says, concerning the gods, firstly, you can't tell whether they exist or not, and secondly, if they do exist, you can't tell what their nature is. And the reason for that is because, as far as we can extrapolate, the gods are not present to us all the time. We cannot observe them literally in the flesh. So according to Protagoras' ideas of relativistic truth, there can be no gods that exist independently of our experience of them. So for as long as we're not experiencing gods, there are no gods.
Okay. Interesting. Okay. Next to the atomism of the ancient world, and I know that atomism, well, obviously they didn't have scientific instruments to kind of, get the revelation that science revealed, millennia later. But they did have this insight, and I think we kind of start with Democritus, with the atomist school. So what can you tell me about Democritus? Did he believe in any kind of divinity? What was his deal?
Yeah, so atomism is another word that begins with an alpha, an A marking absence, and an atom is something that is literally indivisible, from the Greek tome, meaning a chopping up or cutting up or whatever. So, and the atom, the idea is that that's the smallest unit of being, of existence. And what Democritus gives us is a materialist view of the world, a view that all existence in its most fundamental form is made of material particles, which of course, has a long history and is still with us today in many guises. I mean, it's primarily the sort of modern scientific, physical, chemical view of the world. Now, Democritus is an extremely interesting but very elusive figure. We have a fair number of fragments of his, but firstly, separating it from another figure called Leucippus is quite difficult. But secondly, putting it together into a systematic explanation is also quite difficult. But he, in terms of the history of philosophy, and I'm sorry if this is jumping forward onto another slide that you're going to give us, but it's Epicurus, the philosopher Epicurus in the...
Yeah, absolutely. I was going to get to him next.
Okay, so well, let's skip to...
He was a big figure, and obviously in the history of atheism. Although I don't really think you could call him an atheist, at least in the modern sense, right?
Right. Yeah.
Okay.
So, in between Democritus and Epicurus, in the 4th century, right at the beginning of the 4th century, although it's overlapping with Democritus, really, Socrates, the most famous philosopher of all, is executed on the grounds of not believing in gods and corrupting the youth. Now, Socrates, I mean, again, was Socrates an atheist? Silly question to ask, really. It's using completely the wrong category to assess him. But
he thought he had a demon that was kind of telling him what to do. So, right.
Yeah. His defenders would say, well, he used to perform in public sacrifices, he used to swear by divinities.
Right.
So Socrates was one of these figures who had an unconventional view of gods, and in certain respects would use non-divine forms of explanation. But probably if you'd gone up to him and said, do you believe in the gods? He would say, of course I believe in gods. Well, I don't know, we don't have any records of anyone doing that to him. The point I'm making really is that between Democritus and, well, at least between the 5th century and the late 4th century, when we get Epicurus, we have the execution of Socrates on the grounds of not believing in the gods. And that is a huge event in the history of philosophy, because it means that not believing in the gods is something that philosophers become very chary about, or at least not being seen to believe in the gods. So Epicurus, that's Socrates, distinctive face of Socrates with his...
And Mr. Whitmarsh, what would you say is kind of the legacy of Socrates in regards to the history of skepticism and atheism? Because obviously you look at things like the Socratic method, that dialogue of questioning, and you look at something that maybe Plato put into his mouth, and the Euthyphro, with the Euthyphro dilemma. These things are pretty key, as far as the history of skepticism, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, I would. Yes, I mean, as ever, when we're dealing with ancient atheism, there is no linear story to tell. It's not as if this is a story of progressive discovery of some sort of truth about atheism. A figure like Socrates is a really interesting figure, as you say, in all sorts of ways. He's the first really aggressively critical countercultural figure who will say to anyone who comes up to him says, I got the truth about this, whatever, he'll say, no, you haven't. He'll argue them inside outwards. He'll get them to a position where they have to confess that they don't know any truth. And particularly, I mean, the authentic Socrates, insofar as we can reconstruct him, is somebody who really privileges the idea that there is no ultimate truth. And what philosophy's job is to do is to get people to think for themselves and not to absorb society's dogmas. So in that sense, clearly there is a strong, if you like, sort of family resemblance between the techniques that Socrates uses and the techniques of critical detachment and rationalism that are current in modern atheistic circles.
But Socrates didn't really care about like the physical world, right? He was more interested in like ethical debates and what the good life is, mainly, right?
So he's very different from the Ionians in that sense. He's not a philosopher who is interested in the nature of the world, and he Plato says that Socrates explicitly said that in his trial scene, that he started off being interested in the nature of the world, and he realized very soon that people who claim to say the world is of one form, the universe is of one form, whatever, didn't really have any evidence for that. This was all a supposition. So he moved away from that more cosmological thinking towards things that you really could test, such as, do you have an accurate definition for bravery?
What would you say is Socrates' original Euthyphro dilemma, like kind of how he put it? I know he was talking really about piety and not really morality. But how would you formulate that? What his original Euthyphro dilemma was, in that dialogue?
What exactly you mean by the Euthyphro dilemma here? What's the dilemma?
Yeah, like I don't know if you've heard like modern scholars, philosophers use it. Like you talk about what's moral, and you say it's based on divine command. Well, it's something good because God said it, or did God say it because it's good? And if it's good independent of God, we don't need the God, and if it's just whatever God says, and it's arbitrary and anything can be called moral.
Yeah. Yes. Well, yes, you're right. I mean, that is one of the key arguments of that dialogue, and that has affinities to some of the hardcore atheistic, what we would call atheistic now, thinking that is coming out at that time. There's a fragment of drama which seems to be spoken by the mythical character Sisyphus, in which he argues that humans invented the concept of a divinity as a form of social control to essentially to sort of bolster law making and law giving. So if you have just law, then people may conform to the law in public, but they do whatever in private. If you have then you can enforce that by getting people to believe that they're being watched in the private as well. So this idea that morality is somehow intrinsically connected to divinity, or to put it another way, that people need divinity in order to shore up what is good, what is not good, is very much common in this era. And it goes back to relativism, really. I mean, these are forms of relativism extended into the moral world. So if you think there is no good or no bad, as presumably Protagoras would have argued, killing someone isn't good or bad. It just happens to be, what you do, and it's sort of in a way, that I suppose you could understand that killing in self-defense could be a good thing to do. But if you're in that world where there is no good or no bad, objectively speaking, then how do you decide what is good and what is bad? Well,
Well, getting back to the atomism,
yeah.
Specifically Epicurus for a moment. I believe Jason had a couple of questions for you about the possible influence of Buddha on Epicurus and also some of the Stoics like Zeno. So Jason, if you want to go ahead and
Sure. Yeah, I was just curious. Excuse me. I was just curious what your background is on, Pyrrha, who traveled with Alexander and brought back these Buddhist concepts that then went on to influence the Stoics and Epicurus. I'm just curious about how grounded you are in that subject matter.
Well, it's not an area of academic specialism of mine. I would say, though, that there are, as with so many areas of thinking at this time. It's clear that there's a sort of convergence between Greek thought, in particularly this era that we're talking about, and roughly, the period around the 5th century BCE, Greek thought, Indian thought, and even Chinese thought. And this has been referred to as the Axial Age. This was the idea of Karl Jaspers, who believed that there was something in the sort of the international atmosphere that impelled a change in these three cultures towards a more sort of, if you like, rationalistic perspective on things, and towards an understanding of things in a more intellectually curious sense, and move away from traditional ideas into a more testable, sort of empirical conception of things. Now, you can talk, that obviously, to call it an axial age doesn't explain anything, because the next question is, why are these three cultures taking this step at the same time? So you might want to get more precise about this, and you might want to say, well, clearly there's some sort of cultural influence. And as you rightly said, that the Greeks encounter the Indians for certain in the aftermath of Alexander's conquests in the late 4th century. But you might also want to say there is some evidence for contact even before then, because I mentioned earlier the Persian Empire, which was a huge landlocked empire, which touched at its western boundaries, touched on the Greek world, and its eastern boundaries touched on the Indian world. And we do have stories of Greeks and Indians meeting in Persian courts. So hypothetically, we could say that there is cultural transfer going on via the Persian Empire as early as the 6th century BCE, but we can't trace it in any of its linear details. And when you were asking specifically about the aftermath of Alexander's conquests, again, it would be great to know what the sharing of ideas was in this era. Certainly a little bit later on, we get stories about Alexander encountering Brahmins and imbibing some of their religion. We get stories about Greek sages going off to India and wandering around and picking up ideas and coming back and so forth. But in terms of hard and fast evidence for cultural transfer, it's a very gappy picture with lots of static in it.
Okay, because you were mentioning the Axial Age, and Christopher Beckwith talks about that in his book, The Greek Buddha, which was about Pyrrho. And he said because the Persians were such a vast empire, and also on top of that, the Scythian Empire and the Central Asian steppes, that would explain the Axial Age sharing of ideas, that you've got these two empires spanning from China to Greece, and rather than like this era of separate development, that there's this period of transfusion that's going, or diffusion that's going on through the Scythian and Persian empires. Because the reason I got into this is I'm researching my book, and I read your book as well for my chapter on the Greeks. And I first did my chapter on Spinoza, and I was reading Spinoza, and I thought, wait, this is really Buddhist, these kind of elements. And so I emailed Stephen Adler about it. He goes, no, he's Stoic. I went, no, there's more to it than that. And so I really started digging into it. And that's when I found a professor here in Bangkok who wrote a paper about this. And then he put me on to Christopher Beckwith and a couple other people. And then just about 2 weeks ago, I was reading Epicurus's letter to Herodotus, and it just hit me like a ton of bricks that I was reading Spinoza. And so I Googled Spinoza and Epicurus and came up with a book by a Greek professor in Australia that only came out in July, called Spinoza the Epicurean, that discusses how this is really kind of an area of scholarship that hasn't really been touched on by very, very few scholars who have connected Spinoza to Epicurus, which is kind of odd because, I'm just the lay historian. I'm not trained in this. And even I was able to spot how much of Epicurus is in Spinoza. And then so you tie Epicurus back to Pyrrho, and Pyrrho goes back to Buddha, and it's like, okay, so here's where all these ethics of ataraxia and apatheia come in, and that then goes on to influence Spinoza and the modern Western secular democracies. So I just thought it was kind of interesting how they all tied together. And like, I'm glad Landon mentioned, because I mentioned it as well in my book, your quote about the profound ignorance of the classics, and that yes, there's obvious these people were there, and just people don't know about it because they haven't taken the time to read and digest it like you and you do in your book. So I thought it was a really interesting point, the way you phrased it, as this profound ignorance of the ancients. So.
Yeah, what the point I was making there was, I mean, it was a sort of dyspeptic, bad-tempered point, really, about how as we struggle to understand ourselves and our relationship to the past these days, it's really frustrating the way that school education systems have reduced the role of history and the history of ideas in the syllabus. And also that puts a boundary between us and writers in the 19th and 18th century who would have been very familiar with these ideas. And I find that a little bit saddening. But I do also think, I mean, the point underlying what you're saying there about understanding non-Western cultures better, I think that's really important. And I think, if you look at, and there's been a number of publications on the history of philosophy recently, just two pop into my mind. One is Julian Baggini's How the World Thinks, which is a history of global philosophy, not just narrowing it down. And A.C. Grayling also recently has written a history of philosophy that includes elements of Indian and Chinese philosophy to it. So I think people are shifting away from, if you like, a sort of a more linear idea of the history of ideas that goes from the modern West back through the Renaissance to the ancient Greeks and Romans, towards a more diffuse global model of the kind that you're sketching there. It does, however, remain extremely difficult to explain. I mean, as you say, there are people that go from Greece to India, and that might be the point of connection between the two. And there is the Persian Empire, which could well have been a conduit for ideas between East and West. But if you go back to the 6th century BCE, you're really struggling to get any strong information about how people would have got their ideas. And you mentioned diffusionism. This is one of the great questions about the history of not just ideas, but the history of invention of technologies and so forth. Do they emerge in one place and get diffused outwards? Is there a single point of invention of the plough, for example, or are they going to be, is ploughshare technology going to pop up all over the place simultaneously because it's the right time in terms of the history of humanity for that to pop up, because the conditions are right and because, I don't know, the environment is right or whatever for the development of these technologies? People have argued this all sorts of ways. There are people who are very adamant that Greek and Indian thought is interconnected from the start. There are people who are very adamant that the two systems emerge separately because the social and political conditions are similar in these two cultures at that particular time.
Okay, excellent. Jason, did you have anything else you want to add?
Yeah, just I was looking through my notes on where Professor Whitmarsh's name popped up a few times in my writings, and it was on Hippo of Samos. It was one that really kind of caught my attention because just scroll back down to it, because I noted here that you mentioned that Orphism comes from Thrace, but Russell in A History of Western Philosophy posits that it came from Crete, and that the parallels between the dying and rising Dionysus and Osiris are very obvious, and that Crete was the way that Egyptian ideas came in. So I was just kind of curious why you think Orphism came from Thrace, and he's saying it came from Crete.
Well, okay. So I can't remember exactly what I said in the book. It's been a while actually since I read that book, over 5 years now. But I think what I probably said was that Orphism was thought to have come from Thrace, and Orpheus himself was located in Thrace in the Greek imagination. Now, where the underlying ideas come from, the ideas about the afterlife, is a less clear question. Orphism is a very broad category that's used, as I say, in a very nebulous way by scholars. What we now know from archaeological discoveries is that these guides to survival in the afterlife, these techniques for trying to get the soul through to a happier, blissful post-mortem state, seem to have been quite common. We have a number of these tablets that are buried with people, giving them instructions on what to do in the afterlife. And you can you can call them Orphic or not, but it's clearly quite a widely spread idea in Greece. So this whole mystical belief in an existence after death is something that is, it doesn't just come from Thrace and spread southwards. Of course it doesn't, and it's quite likely to have been influenced, I guess, by Egyptian ideas of immortality after death, because the Egyptians were very, very big on that, and we have tangible signs of the effect of Egyptian culture on the Greek world from the 7th century onwards in temple architecture and statuary and so forth. So I mean, I think it's very plausible that Greek ideas of the afterlife were influenced by Egyptian ideas, but I wouldn't, again, I wouldn't want to see it in terms of a single, point of origin for these ideas that then sort of proceed in a linear way through the geographical maze of the Greek world. I think that what Greece is a big, Greece is a trading nation more than anything else. So it's picking up ideas from all over the Mediterranean, just as it's picking up trade goods from all over the Mediterranean. It's really a sort of clearinghouse for all sorts of ideas.
Okay, excellent.
It was interesting. You mentioned like with the Orphics are looking at a way to migrate the soul. And one of the things that I've noticed both in your book, Battling the Gods, and through like Spinoza and the other Enlightenment philosophers, that this denial of the soul seems to be a very common thread amongst all of these philosophers. And I found that to be quite intriguing, that they all kind of pick up on the same thing.
Yeah, I put it the other way around in one sense. I mean, the idea of the soul as something immortal that is within us is actually relatively late in Greek culture, and it is itself a philosophical idea that may be influenced by, as you say, the kind of Orphic mystic idea of survival of the soul after death that shows some signs of Egyptian influence. So in the world of Homer, for example, yes, you get ghosts in the underworld, but there is no idea of the soul as something that a human being has that then survives them into the afterlife. It's only really in mainstream Greek thought, dangerous word, but in mainstream Greek thought, it's really Plato that developed the idea of the soul as something that we have in us all of the time, that requires cultivation, so that in the afterlife it can be in a better state. So,
why Plato would be amenable to the later Christians.
Exactly. Yes. Yeah. Exactly. But there are people like Epicurus and Democritus, the atomists, who believe that the soul is a material thing, and it's in effect it's an organ of the body, sort the seat of thinking and morality, and it dies with us, and it sort of fractures into little atoms after our death. So there's no survival of the death of the human after death, and that's a really strong Epicurean idea. So that may be what you're thinking of in terms of the connection with Spinoza.
Yeah. Briefly on the Stoics, I've heard different kind of interpretations of them. Some say they believe in a world soul, and they didn't really believe in a deity, as we would call a deity. What is your kind of interpretation of them, of the Stoics, in that regards?
I mean, it's, in a sense, it's going back to the Ionian cosmological idea of a sort of super deity, as you say, a sort of world soul that can be identified with existence in all of its animation. So the Ionian question was, I mean, or at least one of the Ionian questions is, why do the stars revolve in recurrent patterns? Why do we get seasonality? Why does the world work for nature? And I think the Stoic idea was a similar sort of one, that there is something divine about the way in which nature operates. But the Stoics have an additional dimension to it, in that they believe in providence. They believe that all of human existence all of existence generally, throughout history, works for a purpose, that it has a sort of, it operates in accordance to a kind of divine plan. So divinity inhabits not just space, but time itself. And it's a sort of all-embracing, all-encompassing way of unifying and making sense of the world.
Okay. Well, I definitely want to get on to Lucretius, because he's obviously an enormous figure in history, period, but specifically, scientific, skeptical tradition. Obviously his what is it called? On Nature. I can't remember the name of the poem. The Nature of Things. There we go. Yeah. So it was a huge poem, obviously, and I can see a lot of similarities in, for example, Enlightenment writers like Dolbach in his System of Nature, some kind of Lucretian type thing. So talk to me a little bit about Lucretius and what exactly he thought, and his impact, and the
Lucretius is one of the earliest major Roman writers. He writes in the 1st century BC an epic poem, which is a beautiful piece of writing, but it enshrines Epicurus's ideas and interprets them for a Roman audience. We have, as you mentioned earlier, we have a certain amount of Epicurus, but we don't have that much. We're really heavily dependent on Lucretius for reconstructing Epicurus's thought. And the current thinking is, as I understand it, that Lucretius is a pretty faithful recorder of Epicurus's thoughts. So it's a very magisterial working out of the implications of a materialist view of the world. But we mentioned earlier that Epicurus is a sort of ambiguous atheist, or an ambiguous theist, if you want to put it in those terms. It's an entirely material view of the world. Nevertheless, Epicurus wouldn't have accepted the designation atheist, and he in fact actually had very harsh words to say about people that didn't believe in the gods. Similarly, Lucretius begins with a hymn to Venus, the goddess Venus, as the generator of all human existence, as the principle of reproduction that powers not just human existence but all animate existence. So it's got that paradox in from the beginning. And there are various points at which Lucretius goes in hard about religion and becomes very critical. So there's a famous point where, do you know the myth of Iphigenia, where Agamemnon, king of the Greeks, is on his way to Troy. They stop off at an island, and then the winds completely die. And it turns out that this is because, according to the myth, because he shot a deer that was sacred to the goddess Artemis, and she won't be appeased until he has to sacrifice his own daughter, Iphigenia. Now, Lucretius says, what a terrible myth and what a terrible deity it would be to demand that someone sacrifice their own daughter just to get the winds going again. Agamemnon didn't do any wrong. He didn't know that it was a sacred deer that he shot. So there's no morality here. And there's a famous line that he comes up with, which was a famous line of Voltaire's as well, which is, such is the great evil that religion is capable of persuading us to do. And by religion, what he means here is a sort of commitment to a particular set of ideas of explanation about the way that the world works. And Lucretius goes from that myth into a very rationalistic, materialistic explanation for the way that winds work. He says we shouldn't believe that winds are driven by gods and divine favor. We need to understand that they are powered by fluctuations and atoms and so forth. So once you start understanding the world in a materialist way, Lucretius channeling Epicurus here, you have a much more peaceable, serene way of looking at things. You don't think of yourself as haunted by terror of divine punishment. You think of yourself simply as a material entity in a material world.
Doesn't he say in that poem, nature will generate herself and everything freely, rid of all gods? Something to that effect.
I haven't got the quote in my mind, but you may well be right, yes.
Something like that, yeah.
I keep on coming back to the point that the Epicureans are very conflicted when it comes to religion. Lucretius says on a couple of occasions, I'll explain the stuff about the gods. I'll explain, because like Epicurus, Lucretius says there are gods. And sometimes he said Epicurus is a god, which is a kind of funny one as well. But he says there are gods, and he says I'll explain about them later, and he never gets around to explaining about them. I do think the Epicureans really struggled with this idea of divinity. I think there must be something to do with the fact that Epicurus knew he couldn't say, I don't believe in gods, because Socrates had been executed for atheism. And I think that created this sort of schizophrenia with religion that the Epicureans always had. Their system pushed them towards an entirely materialistic way of conceiving of things that wouldn't allow for the existence of gods, or at least not gods in any sort of immortal sense. But their commitment pushed them in another direction.
Okay. Speak to me briefly about the figure on the screen right now, Diogenes. What was he in any way an atheist? Like, what was his deal?
So Diogenes, yeah, he was a cynic,
Right.
and the cynics were really one of the most alluring of ancient philosophical schools. They're not really dogmatists at all. They live a life, as they put it, according to nature, which means that they reject anything which they see as social convention. So, I mean, there are all sorts of stories about Diogenes standing up to powerful figures like Alexander the Great. He didn't recognize his authority whatsoever and just sort of roundly abused him. The word cynic, by the way, means dog-like figures. And this idea of the life according to nature was a life lived like a dog, like a lowly creature that scavenges and but nevertheless has a freedom that other human beings, socialized human beings, don't have. We have stories about Diogenes masturbating and defecating all over the place, and not necessarily all over the place, but as a kind of statement of rejection of social values. Now, again, with the cynics, I mean, to call them atheists would probably be, in the modern sense, would probably be to go too far. But they also, sorry, my phone is dinging. They also reject all forms of established religion because it's a form of sociality, to the extent that you might say it's an atheist compatible worldview, but they're just not dogmatics. So atheism is at some level a dogmatic position. It says I take a systematic. I don't know if I need to disable the messages coming through, but I'll give it a go. Anyway, they're anti-dogmatic.
Yeah, some of the figures that I was really I didn't know anything about that I enjoyed reading about in your book Battling the Gods was Clitomachus.
Landon, he's not there. Yeah. He seems to have dropped off.
Oh, he dropped?
Yeah.
Hold on. That's not good. Oh, let me try to get him back. There he is. Yeah, I can't hear you, Mr. Whitmarsh. Tim.
Can you hear me now?
I can hear you. Yeah, you dropped off there for a second. I was just going to ask you about figures like Clitomachus, and I don't know if I'm pronouncing this right at all, Sextus Empiricus, Cardaneus, and they compiled On Atheism. And I wrote a blog actually called Atheist Before Darwin, and I actually referenced your material here. And so tell me about them. Like, what were their arguments? And it was kind of a compilation of, like, I guess, irreligious thought, and it was kind of in the Hellenistic era, right? Yeah. Tell me about those figures and On Atheism, this compilation that they did.
So we're now fast forwarding to the 2nd century BCE, and Carneades and Clitomachus are successors of Socrates. So Plato's school takes an interesting swerve in the 2nd century BCE, and it moves away from that soul-based way of looking at things that you get in Plato himself, and tries to move back to a more, what they see as a more authentically Socratic position. And I mentioned earlier that Socrates is the earliest testimony that we have to Socrates suggests that he is somebody who basically thinks there's no one truth. So that's to say, if you can define bravery to me, I can show you that your definition of bravery is wrong. So what we see in the 2nd century is the re-emergence of that skeptical position, and these figures in the 2nd century BCE are called skeptics, and they specifically argue that there is no truth that can be asserted. But it's a bit more interesting than that, because they also argue for, they say that whilst you can't assert any truth, nor can you necessarily deny that truth, because that is itself a form of assertion, if you like. So what they argue is that the most honest intellectual position is what they call a suspension, which is a suspension between two positions of denial of truth. So when it comes to religion, we get in the 2nd century people writing, or the existence of gods, we get this interest in the question, this is really Clitomachus, this interest in the question of whether gods can exist or not, which is argued both ways. So for every argument that gods exist, there has to be a countervailing argument that gods don't exist. So the ideal skeptical method would be to lay out both the positive and the negative. Now, there's some evidence that Clitomachus may have produced a text called On Atheism, which compiled all of the arguments against the existence of gods, which, just to recap, would have counteracted all of the arguments he compiled for the existence of gods. But what is interesting in terms of the history of atheism is that if it is true that Clitomachus really did write, again, we don't have much of Clitomachus, this is all later testimony that we use to reconstruct this, but if it is true that Clitomachus compiled a text called On Atheism, this is the first time in Greek history that we get the idea of atheism as distinct from atheists. That's to say, a coherent philosophical position denying the existence of gods that has multiple arguments for it. So this is, if you like, the first God delusion.
Okay. Yeah.
We do have, you mentioned Sextus Empiricus, who's a later writer, who's a really important source of this stuff. We have quite a lot of these arguments against the existence of gods preserved in Sextus Empiricus. So it's a really fascinating treasure trove of stuff.
Okay, excellent.
Can jump in for a sec here, because I know that the trilemma that's attributed to Epicurus doesn't appear in any of his extant writings, but there is a very similar one, in Sextus Empiricus. So, do you think that this Epicurean trilemma actually came from Sextus Empiricus?
So, what do you mean by Epicurean trilemma? What?
The one that David Hume formulated: is he willing to prevent evil but not able? Then he's impotent? Is he able but not willing? Then he is malevolent. Is he both able and willing? Whence then is evil? But that doesn't actually appear in any of his writings. But yeah, a very similar thing does show up in Sextus Empiricus. So I'm just curious if you've done any background on that and can maybe comment on it.
No, I don't have an answer to that, but I would say that sounds more like a skeptical argument than an Epicurean argument to me. Just because, as I say, Epicurus, one of the things we know about Epicurus on atheism was that he was antithetical to the idea of atheism. He didn't like it. He called atheists madmen. So I don't think we'd find Epicurus himself coming up with that kind of paradox about divinity. But it is it's the kind of thing that skeptics would say, and it's also the kind of thing that in popular atheism of the later Roman Empire, we get arguments like that.
Yeah, I read in your book, I remember that even someone like Pliny seemed to be kind of a religious skeptic, early Roman writer.
Yeah, I mean, so this is, when I mentioned popular atheism, I didn't necessarily mean man on the street atheism, because as ever with the ancient world, we have very little access to how normal people thought. But there is, from the early Roman Empire onwards, you do get a sort of a spreading out of these philosophical ideas into non-philosophical writers. And the best source for this is a satirist called Lucian, writing in the 2nd century AD, who, I mean, he's very influenced by the Cynics as well. So he's a very non-dogmatic writer, and he can take one position in one text and one position in another text, and he doesn't care about that because he's essentially a comic writer. But he does, time and again, comes back to the idea that the existence of gods is a sort of lunacy, and religious rituals like funerals and so forth don't have any value whatsoever. And he takes a sort of 0-degree position on all of this stuff, as I say, like a cynic, laughing from the outside at the vanities of culture. And as I say, that popular atheism, the spreading out of atheism from philosophical circles into a wider cultural context, is something we can see in the Roman Empire.
Now, the figure of Xenophanes, I remember a quote of his talking about, if triangles had gods, they'd have 3 sides. And I think he said if horses would have gods, they'd look like horses. What is his relevance, with the history of atheism and skepticism?
So Xenophanes we have to rewind all the way back to the Ionians. He's one of them. Okay, so he's century BCE, and he attacks anthropomorphism in divinity. And you are absolutely right. He says if horses had hands and they could draw, they draw dogs like, gods like horses, cows the same. And he also mentions different cultures, different traditions. He said that when you go to Thrace, for example, they draw gods that look like Thracians and so forth. And this is quite interesting because it shows that one of the things that Xenophanes is appealing to here is an expanded worldview. He's saying that I've traveled around, I've been to lots of different cultures, I've seen how they depict the gods, and they all depict them differently. Therefore, they can't all be simultaneously true, which, as I say, is quite an interesting position. That's, in a sense, a culturally relativist position. But Xenophanes deduces from that there is, not that there is no God, but that there is one God, but that God is an abstract principle, that the God doesn't look like a human being and can't be understood in human-like terms, but should be understood in a more, again, it's back to the idea of a divinity that animates nature. And that's a very alien idea to Greek thought. I mean, it's very common now, obviously, through monotheisms, whatever. But in that stage, in the early 6th century, mid 6th century BCE, the idea that a god should be abstract and that a god could not manifest themselves and that God could not take on human form was a very strange idea indeed. To the extent that you might even say that was so unlike a traditional Greek god that it was a form of atheism, because it was redefining the notion of a god so radically that it didn't look anything like a traditional Greek god. But I accept that, that's a bit of a stretch of the word atheism.
Right, absolutely. All right, well, talk to me about Hippocrates, considered the father of medicine. And he seemed to have kind of a naturalistic, skeptical bent at times. His quotes about epilepsy, for example. Where does Hippocrates fit into the history of skepticism and atheism?
So Hippocrates is a sort of, I mean, he was a real person, but we don't know that much about him. But we do have a lot of texts that are from his school, as it were. So we're talking about the Hippocratics, really, rather than Hippocrates himself. And these are late 5th century texts, and they belong to the same sort of era as Protagoras and other people. Hippocrates is obviously often cited as the originator of modern medicine, but I mean, he didn't really, I mean, that's a strange way of putting it, because they didn't know much about the workings of the interior body. They're all hypothesizing about different principles of the hot and the cold and the dry and the wet and all that sort of thing. It's a theoretical model of human health and the human body, rather than one based on empirical science. That you'd have to wait for Galen, for not just Galen, but other later doctors for that. But what Hippocrates is, as you say, his text on epilepsy is really interesting in terms of the process I was talking about earlier of uncoupling material explanations from divine explanations, because epilepsy was known as the sacred disease, and it was thought to be created by or driven by gods. And in his text on the sacred disease, the author, Hippocratic author, says that's a crazy way of looking at things. That's he doesn't quite use the word irrational, but it's a sort of mumbo jumbo way of looking at things. And he says that to understand what epilepsy is, you need rather to understand the nature of the body in theoretical terms, and you need to understand what parts of the body are being inflamed through what causes and so forth. The Hippocratics are really interested in the idea of cause, which they link very closely to material cause, things that you put into your body in terms of food and drink, and the way in which the things you expose your body to in terms of exercise and so forth. These are the causes of illness and health in the Hippocratic worldview. And that idea of causality is very closely related to another figure in that same era, which is Herodotus, the historian, who tries to explain the causes of human political events in terms of human agency largely, rather than divine agency. Herodotus, again, does have a strong concept of divinity.
Right. Well, speaking of historians, early historians, I'm not sure how you pronounce his name. Thucydides? I have his image up on the screen. He was kind of the first secular historian. Is that right? So he kind of like chronicled wars in a secular sense without it, talking about the gods, putting things in motion, things of that nature.
Yeah, I mean, Thucydides is the generation after Herodotus, and you could argue that Herodotus, with his focus on human agency, is doing something secularizing compared to, for example, Homer, who has gods everywhere. Why do things happen in Homer? It's because a god makes them happen. Why do things happen in Herodotus? It's because a human makes them happen. But you're right that whereas Herodotus has this sense of, Herodotus has oracles, Herodotus has a sense of the possibility of divine intervention. He certainly has a sense of protection, that gods protect certain tribes and not others. Whereas in Thucydides, it's a human landscape, and human agency is really paramount there. And he even has one figure who ridicules, if that's the right word, he certainly criticizes for having an set addictions, religious explanation.
You're kind of breaking up a bit, so you keep coming in and out. I'm getting a lot of echo too. I'm not sure what that's about. But okay. Moving to the last kind of figure or group here. Tell me about briefly about the playwrights. Like there's one play called The Clouds that, for example, I forget the name of the playwrights. But go ahead and kind of discuss briefly them and their relevance to kind of this history.
So we're in Athens now, in 5th century Athens, 5th and early 4th century Athens, where there's no TV, there's no internet, but there is a lively culture for debating and sharing ideas, which is the theatre. And we need to unthink our received ideas of what the theatre is, because normally we think of the theatre as something which is a form of elite entertainment for the very learned, the very cultured or whatever. This is not. This is mass entertainment for the citizen body. And the playwrights in particular, although the stories are, there are two main types of drama, I should say. One is tragedy and the other is comedy. And tragedy tends to revolve around mythical stories. Comedies tend to be set in the modern world. But even the tragedies that are set in the distant past often make heavy use of contemporary philosophical ideas. So you do get characters experimenting with the idea of not believing in deities, not believing in predestination. The most famous play about a character who doesn't believe in predestination is Sophocles' play Oedipus, the source of the famous Oedipus complex. Oedipus, there's an oracle that was given to Oedipus's parents and given to him when he's younger, saying that he's destined to kill his father and procreate with his mother. He tries to escape that and believes he has successfully escaped that, and he experiences this as a form of freedom. The chorus, because these plays always have choruses, sing a little song about how religion is, it's probably a wrong translation, but religion is dead as a result of Oedipus's liberation from the oracular predestination. But of course, when the play closes, it's proven that he has in fact killed his father and procreated with his mother, but his mother and father were different people to the ones that he was believing that they were. So a play like that is very clearly, I would say, informed by contemporary ideas about atheism, about disbelief in oracles, but it's exporting them into a distant mythical world. Now, the play that you're talking about, Aristophanes, is, I think The Clouds was the one that you mentioned. Aristophanes satirizes Socrates, the famous philosopher Socrates, and has him saying, I don't believe in the, do you still believe in the existence of gods? That's a mumbo jumbo stuff. We don't do Zeus anymore. You should believe instead in more sort of metaphysical cosmic principles of nature. So it's a satire on intellectual folly, really. And Aristophanes is a satirist who arguably doesn't really have any fixed philosophical positions himself, but he really likes mocking pretensions, and particularly the pretensions of the fashionable young who he sees in the world around him at the moment, who are full of, as he sees it, kind of crazy ideas that make any sense, but highfalutin mumbo jumbo sort of theoretical language. So Plato is a really important sounding box for Athenian intellectual culture, and it gives us real insight into not just what the elite are thinking, but the kind of the mechanisms for circulating these ideas around the populace at large. There were, could have been 20,000 people in the Athenian theatre. It was a huge mass media event.
Right. I wanted to mention briefly Aristotle. He had his prime mover argument, but as I understand it, he had like 17 prime movers, right? Something like that. So how does he fit into this kind of, this history? Because I can't really call him an atheist, but the Christians took up his ideas, and kind of made it their law for a long time, with Aquinas and others. But how do you think he fits in to this?
Yeah, well, that's a good question, not least because I didn't really deal with it with Aristotle in the book. Aristotle is as you say, not really an atheist. I mean, he talks about divinity a fair amount. Nevertheless, he is somebody who whose explanation for the way in which things happen usually depends upon some sort of physical explanation rather than any kind of metaphysical or supernatural explanation. The prime idea that you talk about is a very interesting one because, Aristotle is an obsessive. He doesn't like to leave any aspect of his system unexplained. So he is also a bit like, in a different way, a bit like the Hippocratics and Herodotus. He's obsessed with the idea of cause. How do you explain something being the case? And he has 4 different types of cause, to do with material cause and efficient cause and that sort of thing. But the question is always, if something causes something else, what causes that first thing? So that you end up with a sort of infinite regress unless you have a kind of prime mover, as you say. And it's very interesting and tempting to associate that prime mover with some kind of creator god. But Aristotle is not going to be caught that easily. But you're right that the question of the prime mover, the relationship between the prime mover and deity, is a really fascinating one.
Well, his ethics didn't have any, they didn't invoke divine command at all, I don't believe, right? They were pretty secular.
Yeah.
Were there any thinkers in the ancient world that thought the universe existed forever? I think the Epicureans thought that, right? That there was no start of the universe.
Yeah. Well, I suppose the Epicureans would they would think that atoms are, fundamental principles that are themselves indestructible, and they combine and recombine in different figures. So whilst
Right.
a planet, for example, may not be indestructible, it may come into being at one particular point. It's the constituent elements of it have always existed.
Okay. To close, talk to me about Christianity and the coming of Christianity. That's how you end your book, you
Yeah.
know, and Christianity basically ended, freedom of thought and religious tolerance that had was kind of the main, the way things were. So talk to me a little bit about that, just to kind of close up.
Yeah. I mean, what I would say is that I wouldn't put it again in terms of ended freedom of thought. I would say that Christianity really shifted the territory in which debate occurred. And in later antiquity, you don't get a great obsession with atheism. You get, or at least the word atheism is, or the word atheist is usually targeted at people who don't believe in the Christian God, rather than people who don't believe in any God whatsoever. So the alternative is the Christian God or atheists, who, as I say, may include people that follow Jupiter or follow, I don't know, some other culture's deities. And even actually within Christians themselves, of course, because Christians love making divisions in antiquity, where distinction between all, proper Christianity and other people's Christianity or whatever. So the terrain in which people are fighting to define themselves becomes much more narrowly focused on Orthodox Christian belief, Orthodox as defined by the speaker at any one particular time, and moves away from the question of supernatural versus non-supernatural modes of understanding. So as I say, I wouldn't say it's the end of thought. I would say it's that the room in which freedom of thought operates gets arguably shrunk, so that we can't conceive anymore of non-deist,
Right. Well, I've heard it said that philosophy became kind of the handmaid, the servant of Christian theology, and I think you said in your book also that there were no like religious wars before monotheism, because it was an accepted fact that everybody, they worship different gods,
Yeah.
and so that was kind of a new thing, the inherent intolerance that monotheism brought. So
Yeah, when I wrote that, I was very influenced by a guy called Jan Assmann, who's a German scholar who believes, scholars these days tend to be very circumspect, as you can tell I'm being as well. And they don't like to say there's a hard and sharp distinction between this and that. But Assmann had a moment of great intellectual courage and said there is actually a difference in kind between monotheism and polytheism. And the difference is a polytheistic mentality says that there is no essential difference between one culture and another culture in religious terms, because a polytheistic mentality is elastic, and the God that you call something might be the God that I call someone else. They might be the same gods with different names, or it might be just that you've got more gods than us. That's fine. None of this threatens the polytheistic worldview, because the polytheistic worldview is infinitely expandable. The monotheistic worldview, on the other hand, cannot deal with religious difference in
right.
And so that,
And
I'm sure there are all sorts of ways of saying that's a reductive distinction, and that you can nuance it or whatever. But I do think it sort of holds true in a kind of way.
yeah. Well, echoing back to the beginning of the talk, the Greeks did kind of they thought freely, and they wrote freely. They didn't have any kind of dogma or orthodoxy that they had to conform to, and post-Christian, when Christians came to power, that was very different. They had to, the Christians persecuted not just pagans, they persecuted other Christians, who didn't, fit the main, Orthodox, the Catholicism, or whatever that went out. So there's kind of a big difference there, wouldn't you say?
Yeah. Again, I mean, talking in broad terms is dangerous, but I think you are kind of right at one level, in the sense that the penalties for transgressive speech in the pre-Christian Greco-Roman world weren't kind of super strong. There were times when, I mean, I talk in the book a little bit about moments of, if you like, persecution of atheists, and they did happen.
Socrates, kind of.
Yeah, exactly. That's one example. Greeks and Romans were very capable of anti-Semitism as well. So it's not as if there was complete freedom of thought and freedom of, idea and expression or whatever. And certainly by the time you get to the Roman Empire, there are dangers within the city of Rome itself in speaking out against the Roman Empire. So there are all sorts of ways in which speech is controlled. But I think you're right that when it comes to experimentalism with cosmology, with mind, with ethics, the Greco-Roman world basically said, go create, and the early Christian world circumscribed the sphere in which you could go and create. You still had some room for expression, obviously,
right?
And people that said heretical things, and got and had to move to different places and so forth. And there were still philosophers who were still influenced by classical ideas, and there were still people coming up with new ideas. But I think you're right that the room for maneuver was now limited.
Well, the Christians, they burned a lot of the classical writing. I mean, from what I've read, they preserved some of it, what they thought, I guess, they could use, but they burned an awful lot of it, right? So
they didn't preserve all of it. They chose what to preserve. I don't know, book burning is, that's a very controversial area. They certainly, there's quite a lot of evidence for destruction of artworks, of pre-Christian religious artworks being sort of smashed and thrown down wells and that sort of thing.
And repurposed to, like, converted into, like, I think the Temple of Artemis converted into a church and things of that nature.
Yeah. But also that sort of thing is, in a way, part of what every single culture does. That every single culture reuses buildings from the past, particularly big, swanky, grand buildings, because they're in short supply. So it makes sense to convert it to a use that you want it for, rather than a use for the next generation. So I don't know. I think it's a mixture of, there are some cases where you really do see Christians smashing up the past. And as I say, it's particularly statuary. But there are some cases where it's simple, innocent reuse. And there are some cases where, when it comes to the transmission of classical learning, I think it's worth remembering that although there was a lot of stuff that they didn't preserve, there's also a lot of stuff that they did preserve. And it's quite interesting what they did preserve, because Aristophanes, that we mentioned earlier, the comic playwright, is full of vulgarity and things that you wouldn't necessarily have expected to be congenial to a Christian mindset, but they did preserve it for some reason. So I think the record for early Christians for preserving classical culture is, it's a checkered one. It's not straightforwardly bad.
Yeah. The only other thing I wanted to ask is, what is your thought about the kind of the idea of resignation that you find in Stoicism and Epicureanism? Like, when we get to the Enlightenment, like the radical Enlightenment, authors like Diderot, they kind of rejected that as kind of an unhuman or inhuman mentality. That the key is to control your passions, or to steer them to useful ends. That the passions are kind of our highest, even erotic passion is kind of our highest, ideal or level we can get to. And reason is very important, but so what are your thoughts of just resignation in general? Because obviously pure stoicism is not very conducive to a fulfilled life. I don't think it's a useful technique sometimes, but
no, I think I'm with you, and I think this idea of control is what it's all about, ultimately.
Yeah.
And the Greeks and the Romans were obsessed with control and hierarchy and power. And you had to have control over yourself as well. And that was the critical thing. And it's usually seen as control of the rational part of the soul over the emotional part of the soul. And as you say, there are times when it's really important to have that capacity. But it's a very, as you say, it's a very, it's not a way of leading your life that's very congenial to the modern world. And also that metaphor of control, we have to remember it is the same metaphor as they used for, or in reality, for controlling women and controlling slaves and animals and so forth. So it is an idea of dominance that has wider political ramifications than simply emotional.
Yeah. Okay, well, Mr. Whitmarsh, it was an honor to have you on. Your book is great. Again, it's Battling the Gods. So yeah, thanks so much for coming on. It's been fascinating. Yeah.
Great to meet both Landon and Jason, and see you soon.
Yep. Take care.
Bye.